Okay, this one's different. This isn't just dark. It's one of the most twisted, brutal stories you'll ever hear. But before we go any further, hit subscribe, tap that like button, and drop a comment if you've heard of Fred and Rose West, or if this case is completely new to you. Because once you know what really happened inside 25 Cromwell Street, you'll never forget it. Your subscriptions help the channel grow, and we really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm definitely intrigued now. What are we diving into today on Case Closed?
Well, today we're going to be talking about Fred West, who was a British serial killer active in like the 60s through the 80s. And, it's one of those cases that just shows how like evil can hide in plain sight.
Oh, Fred West. Yeah, that's a name that sends chills down the spine of pretty much anyone in the UK. And you're absolutely right about evil hiding in plain sight. I mean, he and his wife Rose were literally killing people in their family home for decades while raising their children there. It's just absolutely mind-blowing when you really think about it.
I know, right? It's terrifying. So, can you give our listeners some background on Fred? Like, where did he come from? And how did this all start?
Yeah, so Fred was born in 1941 in Much Marcle, Herefordshire. He grew up in this really poor farming family, and it was a pretty close-knit family, but also really dysfunctional. His father was super strict and disciplinarian, while his mother was extremely overprotective of Fred specifically.
So, was there anything in his childhood that maybe, I don't know, pointed to what he would become later?
Well, that's the thing that's fascinating about these cases. There were definitely some red flags. Fred later claimed that his mother had sexually abused him when he was about 12. And he also claimed to have engaged in bestiality in his early teens. And he developed this really disturbing belief that incest was normal because he claimed his father had incestuous relationships with Fred's sisters. Now, his younger brother Douglas later dismissed a lot of these claims as complete fantasy, but regardless, by his teens, Fred was already showing really troubling behavior.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So he was already showing signs of being, like, dangerous as a teenager?
Oh, absolutely. By age 17, he was known for aggressively approaching women and girls, and he would just fondle them without any permission. He objectified women completely, just saw them as sources of pleasure. And when a girl did accept his advances, they would find the experience really unsatisfying because his only goal was his own gratification. He just didn't care about anyone else.
Ugh, that's so gross. So, at what point did things escalate from harassment to actual violence?
Well, in 1961, when Fred was about 20, his own 13-year-old sister Kitty told their mother that Fred had been raping her since the previous December and had gotten her pregnant. He was arrested. And get this, he freely admitted to police that he'd been molesting young girls since his early teens and even asked them, "Doesn't everybody do it?" Like it was completely normal behavior.
Oh my God, that's horrible. What happened with that case? Did he go to prison?
No, and that's where the system really failed. The case collapsed when Kitty refused to testify against him. His family basically disowned him, except his mother, who was willing to defend him despite being disgusted by what he'd done. But without Kitty's testimony, the charges were dropped.
That seems to be a pattern with a lot of these cases, right? Like early warning signs that just don't get properly addressed by the justice system.
Yeah, and it's incredibly frustrating to look back at these cases because there were so many points where intervention could have potentially saved lives. And this was just the beginning for Fred. Not long after this, he met his first wife, Catherine Costello, who everyone called Rena, and their relationship would eventually lead to some of his first known murders.
So, what was his relationship with Rena like? Was she involved in his crimes, or was she a victim?
Well, it's complicated. Rena was pregnant by someone else when she married Fred in 1962. They moved to Scotland, where Fred worked as an ice cream van driver. Rena had her daughter Charlemagne, and then she and Fred had a daughter together named Anna Marie in 1964. But Fred was incredibly abusive toward Rena and the children. He would, keep the girls locked in the bottom of a bunk bed with bars fitted between the bunks, essentially caging them. They were only allowed out when he was at work.
That's awful. Those poor children.
It was absolutely terrible. And during this time, they also met Anne McFall, who was a friend of their nanny, and became Fred's first known murder victim. She disappeared in July 1967 when she was 18 and pregnant with Fred's child. Her dismembered remains weren't found until 1994, but the really disturbing thing is that by the time he killed Anne, Fred had already developed what would become his signature, dismembering his victims and keeping certain bones, particularly finger bones, as souvenirs.
Oh God, that makes me feel sick. So what about his second wife, Rose? When did she enter the picture?
Fred met Rose Letts in early 1969, shortly after her 15th birthday. And this is where things get even more disturbing, if you can believe it. Rose was already known to be overtly promiscuous, despite never having had a boyfriend. Fred was 27 at the time, and he quickly ingratiated himself with her by claiming he and his two daughters had been abandoned by his wife.
Wait, so he was seeing a 15-year-old when he was 27? That's predatory right from the start.
Exactly. It was predatory from day one. And Rose's father, who was actually diagnosed with schizophrenia and is believed to have molested Rose herself, vehemently disapproved of the relationship. He threatened Fred directly and promised to call social services if he continued to date his daughter. But Rose defied her parents and moved in with Fred when she turned 16.
So, two people who had both experienced abuse as children ended up together, and then they started abusing others?
That's exactly what happened. And they became this perfect storm of depravity. They married in January 1972, though Fred falsely described himself as a bachelor on the marriage certificate. Soon after, they moved to what would become their infamous address, 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester. And this is where the majority of their crimes would take place over the next 15 years.
The House of Horrors, right? I've heard it called that.
Yeah, that's exactly what the press called it. And it really was. Shortly after moving there, Rose began working as a prostitute with Fred's encouragement. He installed peepholes so he could watch her with clients. And they amassed a large collection of bondage equipment and pornography. But their sexual interests went way beyond that. They were specifically interested in domination, pain, and violence.
And what about their children? I mean, they had children living in this house where all these horrible things were happening, right?
They did, and that's one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case. Between them, they had 8 children together, though at least 3 of Rose's children were conceived with clients. And all of the children suffered terrible physical and sexual abuse. When they reached 7 years old, they were assigned numerous daily chores and had to follow strict rules, with severe punishment, almost always physical, for not conforming.
That's just unimaginable. Did any of the children try to get help or escape?
2 of them, Heather and her younger brother Stephen, ran away from home at different points, but they both ended up returning after several weeks of sleeping rough or staying with friends. And when they did return, they were severely beaten. Between 1972 and 1992, the West children were admitted to hospital emergency departments 31 times with various injuries, but these were always explained away as accidents and never reported to social services.
So when did they start, killing people other than Fred's first victim?
Well, Rose actually committed her first murder before she and Fred even married. In June 1971, while Fred was in prison for theft, Rose murdered Fred's 8-year-old stepdaughter Charmaine. It's believed she killed her in a fit of domestic violence. Then, when Charmaine's mother Rena came looking for her daughters in August 1971, Fred killed her too, likely to prevent any investigation into Charlemagne's whereabouts.
Oh my God, that's horrific. His own stepdaughter?
Yes, and that was just the beginning. From 1973 to 1979, they killed at least 8 more young women. The victims were often lodgers at their house, hitchhikers, or young women they'd picked up. And the pattern was almost always the same. They would sexually abuse and torture these women before killing them and dismembering their bodies. Most of the victims were buried in the cellar of 25 Cromwell Street, while others were buried in the garden.
So, how were they finally caught? I mean, they got away with this for so long.
It's actually their own daughter Heather who ultimately led to their downfall. They murdered her in 1987 when she was 16, likely because she had threatened to reveal the abuse that was going on in the household. Fred would later joke to the other children that they would end up under the patio like Heather if they misbehaved.
He joked about murdering his own daughter? That's just evil.
It really is just pure evil. And eventually, these comments about Heather, plus the continuing abuse of their other children, led to a police investigation. In 1992, Fred was accused of raping his 13-year-old daughter, and though those particular charges were dropped, the police began investigating Heather's disappearance. In February 1994, they got a search warrant for 25 Cromwell Street.
And that's when everything came to light?
Exactly. Once the police started searching the property, Fred initially denied everything. But when they found human remains in the garden, he changed his story and confessed to killing Heather. He then gradually admitted to more murders, eventually confessing to a total of 12, though he claimed Rose knew nothing about them. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that Rose had been an active participant in many of the killings.
So what happened to them after they were caught?
Well, Fred never stood trial. While on remand in prison on January 1995, he committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell. Rose, on the other hand, was tried for 10 murders in October 1995. Despite maintaining her innocence, she was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison with a recommendation that she never be released. And to this day, she's still in prison, still insisting she had nothing to do with the murders.
That's just such a horrific case. I mean, the scale of their crimes and the fact that they were able to hide it for so long while living a seemingly normal life in some ways, it's terrifying.
It really is one of the most disturbing cases in British criminal history. And what makes it even more tragic is that there were so many warning signs and opportunities for intervention that were missed. From Fred's early crimes to the numerous hospital visits of their children, to neighbors who heard screams, the system failed these victims time and time again.
I think that's what makes these true crime cases so important to discuss, you know? Like, it's not just about the horror of what happened, but learning from it so that hopefully these warning signs don't get missed in the future.
Absolutely. And that's why podcasts like Case Closed are important. We need to remember these victims and learn from these cases, because understanding how these crimes happened and why they weren't stopped sooner is essential if we want to prevent similar tragedies in the future.
Well, thank you for walking us through this really difficult case, Adrian. I know it's not easy to talk about such dark subject matter, but I think it's important that we do.
You're absolutely welcome, Anna. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode of Case Closed. As always, we encourage you to do further reading on this case if you're interested, and we'll be back next week with another case to discuss.
Until next time, I'm Anna.
And I'm Adrian. And this has been Case Closed.